Well, hello and welcome to this session of Execunet Masterclass. I'm your host, as always, Tony Vlahos, and my guests this hour are Connection Culture Group partners Michael and Katie Stallard. With the majority of our day spent at work, the cost of not connecting with those around us poses significant threats to both our personal health and organizational performance. Today, Katie and Mike will address this topic in depth and share approaches you can implement to develop a culture of connection in your workplace and in your home. Really important stuff and part of our daily commitment here at Execunet to connect you with trusted advisors like Mike and Katie who can help you create the transformative results you want in your career, the world of work, and in your everyday life. So let's begin at the beginning with a few housekeeping things that will make your experience today all the more enjoyable and valuable. First, by now you should have received the PowerPoint deck for today's session. Many of you are nodding. Yes, I can tell. That's great. If you're sure you have not, fear not. You can access the slides in PDF straight from the screen in front of you. Just look under the handout section on your right. And if you have any trouble, of course, chat to us and my amazing colleague Kim will help you out. Second, do not be shy. If you'd like to ask Katie or Mike questions, and I certainly encourage you to do that, you can chat those in and I'll do my best to relay as many as possible to them before the end of the session. Finally, very important, please complete your evaluation before you go. I know that Mike and Katie value your feedback and Kim and I do too. It really does help us serve you better. Well, I am thrilled to bring on the leaders of today's session. Michael and Katie Stallard are partners of Connection Culture Group, a leadership training and consulting firm based in Greenwich, Connecticut. They are also co-authors of the amazing title, Connection Culture, the Competitive Advantage of Shared Identity, Empathy, and Understanding at Work. Their clients have included Costco, Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, NASA, the U.S. Treasury Department, and many others. In fact, one of them, TCU, created the Center for Connection Culture based on Michael and Katie's work. Pretty amazing. With that, welcome Mike and Katie to the Executive stage. They are all yours.
Hi, Tony. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Tony.
Good to be here. Welcome, everyone. So just a little background. I came to appreciate the importance of culture through work experiences. There were times in my career when I worked in roles where I was eager to get up in the morning and the hours flew by during the day and I didn't want to stop at the end of the day. And there were other times where I did not look forward to getting up. I struggled to get up in the morning. The hours passed ever so slowly, and by the end of the day, I was exhausted. And I realized that I hadn't changed. It was something about the environment I was in that had that impact on me. And it got me thinking about, is there a best culture where I would be energized all the time and thrive? And then, much of my career I spent on Wall Street and I was involved in a number of mergers. And if you look at the research, it shows that over 80% of the mergers do not add value. And for those of us who have had close-up views of mini mergers, we oftentimes find that there's a great plan going into the merger, but the difference in the cultures of the two organizations clash after the merger closes, and it sabotages post-merger performance. So many mergers, 4 out of 5 don't live up to the expectations going in. So I realized once again that culture is very important. It's important to help me thrive in the workplace I'm in, important to you to help you thrive, and it's also affecting our organizations. And then Katie and I went through a personal experience that really brought to light how important culture is. I decided to leave Wall Street in 2002 and was doing research with colleagues that led to starting a company. And we published our first book in 2007 called Fired Up or Burned Out. And it was shortly after I left Wall Street that Katie was diagnosed with breast cancer, and then within a year with advanced ovarian cancer. And at that time, as you can imagine, it was, I wanted to look at all the research. Katie didn't want to look at any of the research. She's shaking her head here next to me. She didn't want to see any of the research. But I can tell you her probability of survival was less than 10%, that she would survive for more than 5 years. And we knew we had to be aggressive, so Katie was treated at our hospital that's part of Yale New Haven, where we happen to be speaking tomorrow. And then we did part of her treatments at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. And we just found amazing support from our care teams at Yale New Haven, at our local hospital, Greenwich Hospital, part of Yale New Haven, and Sloan Kettering. And there was one time in particular where I want to share with you. Katie did the standard treatments that people who were uh, diagnosed with ovarian cancer go through, 6 rounds of chemotherapy. We knew we had to be aggressive, so we signed her up for a program that was somewhat experimental at that time at Sloan Kettering in Midtown Manhattan. And hope you can envision this as I describe it. We parked our car, we're walking down the street toward the entrance of Sloan Kettering, and this doorman, a guy by the name of Nick Medley, who you can see on this page, there's Nick. He locks his eyes on Katie as soon as she gets within eyesight. He smiles and he greets her like a returning friend. Now, this is in Midtown Manhattan where nobody makes eye contact. And it just really surprised me to see this guy greeting us in that way. And so we meet Nick, we walk into the entrance, and the receptionist is calling everyone honey. Also very unusual in Manhattan. The security people and administrative people we met at Sloan Kettering were upbeat. They were just friendly and helpful. And then we spent an hour with Katie's oncologist, Dr. Marty Hensley. She educated us about the treatment options, answered our long list of questions, and she was upbeat and optimistic. And I remember she said to Katie, Katie, women do survive this disease. You don't look at the statistics, you're not a statistic. And she was upbeat and optimistic. And by the end of the day, we just felt a sense of connection to the people we met at Sloan Kettering. And I can tell you, when I was walking down that sidewalk toward the entrance, I was expecting to find a culture of death and dying. It's a cancer center. But to my surprise, it was the opposite. It was a culture of life and living and energy and optimism, and people who knew they were making a difference in the world. And it was, for me, it was such a contrast to what I had experienced on Wall Street. It naturally got me thinking, what if a culture like this existed on Wall Street, where people were focused on just the importance of their role and the work they're doing, because Wall Street is important. But instead, most people who work on Wall Street are focused on kind of a net wealth number that they want to reach so they can get out of there as fast as possible. They just don't tend to be healthy cultures. And so this was a real eye opener to me. We had a great experience at Sloan Kettering, and earlier this year we celebrated Katie's 15th year of being cancer-free from advanced ovarian cancer. She's now a 3-time cancer survivor, but the doctors feel she'll be fine, and we're going to be grandparents in October, so we're excited about that. That's someone else. So since that time, after Katie is healthy now, and we really started to embark on this area of working with organizations, and it's been a wide variety of organizations that we've worked with. One of the early groups we worked with was the engineering section of the NASA Johnson Space Center. We're doing work now for Costco and Sloan Kettering. As Tony mentioned, we have a center at TCU. Just a real wide variety of business, government, healthcare, and higher education organizations. And in the next 40 minutes or so, we're going to share some of the highlights of what we've learned about culture, and a culture that helps individuals and organizations thrive. So one of the things we've learned is, and this is the model we use, that leaders are intentional about task excellence, right? We're paid to get things done, so that's obvious, and we focus on tasks and results. But the great leaders do something in addition to that. They focus on tasks and results, but they also are intentional about developing relationship excellence. And that makes all the difference when leaders are leading beyond authority, because they have authority to hire, fire, pay, and promote. People will follow them. But when they follow them because of their relationship, because they feel that sense of connection, in addition to the authority they have, it makes all the difference in the performance of people in terms of things like employee engagement that we'll get into later. And that together, task excellence and relationship excellence, is what produces sustainable superior performance. And as we dug in to our research and other research that had been done, we came to realize that there are three things that really drive this relationship excellence that unites people and creates this sense of connection. One, that leaders communicate a vision that unites people. They value people as human beings, not just treating them or thinking of them as means to an end, and they give them a voice. And if leaders do that, or if we're intentional about getting in cultures that have those attributes, it creates this great sense of unity and connection and camaraderie, and what has also been called esprit de corps, the spirit of the group. And that produces sustainable superior performance.
So if we were together, I would start this conversation that we're having in talking about culture and why it matters by having us kind of think back on our own work experiences. And since Mike first began digging into employee engagement and culture, so that he could understand it for himself, and then after it turned into a second career, he's been asking people to, think back on the jobs they've had and what was it about a job that made them either feel fired up or burned out. And, he's done this at Sloan Kettering and MD Anderson Cancer Center and with people in all sorts of industries. And invariably, we hear the same kinds of comments. Things like, I was fired up because we shared vision about how we could bring something new to the world and make a difference. Or someone might say, my boss cared about me as a person, or my opinion counted. And on the negative side, these were kind of common themes. There are too many priorities and they're constantly changing. My to-do list never stops. I felt micromanaged. I wasn't listened to, and people were competing rather than collaborating with each other. So if we were together, I would say, how about you? What have your experiences been like? And when we have looked at our own research and we've assimilated insights from a number of scholars, we've been able to identify 7 universal needs that we have as people. And when they're met, they make us feel connected to our work, to the people we work with, and our organization. And here they are: respect, recognition, belonging, autonomy, personal growth, meaning, and progress. And you can see how these human needs that we have factor into whether you've had a positive or a negative reaction. We want autonomy. So when we feel micromanaged, that really impacts us. So let's talk about different kinds of cultures. The culture that you're in is either going to pull you in, energize you, connect you, or it's going to push you away, drain you, or disconnect you. And let me just stop for a moment and talk about that word culture, because it's used in lots of different ways depending on the context. And in the work setting, for some people, culture can be kind of a fuzzy concept. But we believe you can deconstruct an organization's culture by looking at the attitudes, and this would be the feelings or ways of thinking that affect behavior. The language, what are the words being used to express feelings and thoughts? And also the behavior, the ways that people act. So let's jump into these 3 types of cultures that we've identified. The first is a culture of control. And in this kind of a culture, those with the power, status, or influence, well, basically rule over others. And how does that feel? If you're being controlled, well, one or more of these might apply. You feel left out, micromanaged, unsafe, hyper-criticized. You might even feel helpless. And a culture of control breeds an environment in which people fear to make mistakes or take risks, and they're afraid to speak up. This kills innovation, And often you'll see that information and perspectives that are important for decision making don't make it up to the surface. So let's move on to the next culture. This would be a culture of indifference, and we see this quite often. Here, leaders are so busy that they fail to take the time necessary to develop healthy and supportive relationships with their peers, and especially with those who report to them. And well, there are also leaders who frankly don't care much about people, or maybe they don't see the value in the relational side of work. And whether they say it out loud or not, you can pick up their attitude of, you're not getting paid to have friends or be happy at work. You're being paid to get a job done. Get back to your desk. And how does it feel to be in a culture where someone is indifferent to you? Well, you might feel like a cog in a machine, or a means to an end, unimportant, underappreciated, uncertain. You know, does my boss like me? Is my job secure? Or even invisible. Does anybody care about me here? So it's interesting to note that in both of these cultures, people might struggle with loneliness, and we have a way of masking that, so it might not be obvious to you. But I find that the natural response in being in these cultures is to kind of pull back, self-protect, you know, put your head down, just do enough to keep your paycheck coming, but participate less. And depending on how far it's gone, you might even see people who are purposely withholding information or beginning to sabotage the work being done. And if you're in a culture of control or indifference and you're feeling consistently unsupported or left out, you know, it begins to take a toll. And if you don't have the psychological resources to cope with stress, the stress that we have in modern organizational life, a person might turn to unhealthy attitudes or behaviors, and some of these are addictive and destructive. So let me wrap up this section here. The common feature in both of these kinds of cultures is a real focus on tasks. So let's move to something positive. Connection culture. Okay, here, people care about their work and they care about others, and they're going to take the time to invest in developing those healthy relationships, reaching out to help each other. And as Mike may have mentioned, I think, the bond of connection that we see here creates this sense of community and unity, and it's inclusive and energizing. And from this place, there's productivity and innovation. So let me say one more thing, because you're going to hear us say the word connection quite a lot. It's our favorite word. So let me give you a definition of connection, or how we think of it. And that is, we're going to get to this poll in just a minute. Let me say this definition, and that is that it's a positive bond that's based on shared identity and empathy and understanding, and it moves individuals toward that group-centered membership. So disconnection would be anything less than that positive bond. Okay, it looks like we are moving to our first poll. Is that what we have? Okay, so I'm curious to know, have you experienced over the course of your career a culture of control? Have you experienced a culture of indifference? Have you experienced a culture that connects people? So jump in with your answers, and then Tony will watch those for us and report back.
And for this question, which one have you experienced the most over your career?
Oh, you only get to choose one? Okay, all right. Well, which one have you experienced most then?
Okay, the polls are open and the results are streaming in. So we'll give it a few seconds and then I'll share.
Okay.
We're not going to venture any guesses. We'll wait for the actual results.
Okay. I'm pulling for connection, but I have a feeling it's going to be one of the other two.
Katie, you have time to change your bet here, okay? All right, so we're gonna. All right, so over half of our audience today reports that they have felt well, they've experienced a culture of control, over half,
Yeah. Yes.
and
Mhm.
I'm sorry.
roughly a third culture of indifference, and less than 20% a connection culture.
Okay, well, I'm going to deputize all of us to be ambassadors to bring a culture of connection into our workplaces. Let's see if we can't get that number higher.
Okay, so just to give you some examples of, we've seen a wide variety of organizations over the 15 years that we've been doing this, and we thought we'd share some of what we've learned. We've already talked about Sloan Kettering, and you can see in just the tagline to their logo, the best cancer care anywhere. And we found that, you know, we continue to work with them, and we hear, even just recently, I read an email from one of our clients there who used that phrase, the best cancer care anywhere, because it really communicates their vision, their identity. And it's a phrase that's really stuck in the conscious of many people who work there. It's very aspirational. And we found that there are quite a few people there who also their lives have been touched by cancer in some way. Either they've had cancer or a loved one has had, a friend has had cancer. So they really bring a lot of passion to their work. And we see that they also value people. We saw that in the example that we used, what we experienced at Sloan Kettering. People have a voice there, and oftentimes in healthcare, what you find is that the organizations are very high on vision and not as strong on value and voice. So for most healthcare organizations, it's important to strengthen value and voice, and so you'll find that most are working on that. Just a very different client is Costco. And Costco in the last year and a half has been recognized as the best large company employer in America. That's based on research from Forbes and Statista. Um, their culture, I remember speaking with Jim Sinegal, the longtime, he's co-founder and longtime CEO, and I asked him, how would you describe your culture? And Jim said, do the right thing. And I was like, I kind of turned my head like, what? What does that mean? And he said, well, that means something very specific to us. It means, number one, we obey the law. Number two, we take care of our members, which is they're a membership-based warehouse club. So that's, in a sense, their customer. We take care of our members. Number three, we take care of our employees. We respect our suppliers. And if we do the previous four things, we'll reward our shareholders. And if you know anything about Costco, they really do. So for example, when it comes to taking care of members, if they have suppliers who they feel don't meet their standards, they'll create their own manufacturing operation to deliver goods to, under the Kirkland brand, to deliver goods to their members that meet their standards. And so they really do take care of their members. And you also see that they take care of their employees. They pay attractive wages and benefits. Wall Street is always giving Costco a hard time. Feels like they overpay their employees and they give them too generous benefits. But the people at Costco, most of the people at the top of Costco have started out on the bottom, things like shagging carts in the parking lots, and they've worked their way to the top of the organization through hard work and their ability. And they know that it's important to, they've given raises every year, which is pretty extraordinary, even through recessions. So they really do take care of their employees. You see it in just the mentoring and apprenticeship type relationships they have throughout the organization to help people rise to their degree of ability and aspirations. And then they also, I spoke to all of Costco's warehouse managers worldwide at one of their annual managers conferences in Seattle. And I was there that morning, and they were showing videos of people around the world who worked at Costco had come up with ways to improve efficiency, reduce costs, better serve their members, better ways to take care of their employees. And it was just inspiring to see how people throughout the organization worldwide had a voice. They recorded little videos of these ideas, and it was a great way to disseminate those ideas to warehouse managers who could then embrace these ideas that happen in other parts of Costco and boost performance in the warehouse they were responsible for leading. So you really see this great culture. You see vision in their do the right thing culture, which I see it as articulating their vision. They value their employees and the way they pay them and treat them, and their employee retention is roughly 95% on a year-to-year basis, which is multiples better than most organizations who are in comparable businesses. So they really have an economic benefit from that. And they retain, almost somewhere around 97, 98% of their managers from year to year. So they have very high loyalty and retention rates among their employees because of the connection culture they have. Then a third organization we do some work with is Texas Christian University. It's they're getting something like 20,000 applications for 1,800 freshman seats every year. So really a very popular school right now. And their vision is to produce ethical leaders and citizens in the global world we live in. And they have they're amazing when it comes to connection. The chancellor, Victor Bashini, who's an amazing connector himself, he's seen over the course of his career in education that students who have those supportive relationships fare better in terms of academically. They have much higher graduation rates. So TCU is very intentional about investing early in the student's relationship to try to build those connections with, either people they meet. They have over 200 programs on campus, so it could be becoming involved in intramural sports or faith communities on campus or other areas to serve. They have many programs that serve in the community, but they're all about really building relationships that support students so that they can cope with what's been called learning anxiety. It's challenging to be in a historically liberal arts school that has high standards, and students coming in, the relationships they have at home are no longer there, not very easy access, and so they have to build new relationships. So they're really great about creating that, and they're also great about creating that culture for faculty and staff. And so they have very high retention rates of the people who work there. There's just this great value for relationships and connection, and they've really thrived as an organization because of it. So Katie shared with you the definition of connection already. So we'll be sharing these slides with you. Just want to talk a little bit about the research. And if we're working with lawyers, engineers, physicians, sometimes we'll spend a half a day on the research. I can say that I'm a lawyer, so I had 3 years of training in skepticism, and we don't have that much time here, so I'm going to try to highlight it for you. And when you look at just the world we all live in today, it's moving at a pretty fast pace, isn't it? Research shows that 80% of Americans say they feel afflicted by stress. So I think a lot of us have experienced that. And in addition to just the higher stress we have to cope with today, we also are facing a time when more and more people are lonely. And you may have seen some of the research. I was just out speaking in Utah and met Julianne Holt-Lundstedt, who's a professor at Brigham Young University. She aggregated all the research worldwide. I think it was in excess of 500 respondents for each research study. She aggregated it, and what she found, it's really been in the news worldwide. Her research is really being viewed globally these days because it was pretty stunning. She found that individuals who had higher social connections had a 50% reduced risk of early death, and those who were lonely or socially isolated. In other words, they felt lonely, irrespective of the number of people they were around, or they weren't around people, they were socially isolated, that they had a risk of early death. They were associated with the risk of early death that was comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And that risk of death was higher than the risk from known risk factors like obesity or pollution, other things like that. So loneliness combined with stress is lethal. And it's something that we have to deal with in our culture today. Now, the way we like to boil it down when you look at all the research is that connection should really be thought of as a superpower. And this description of it came from Matthew Lieberman. He is a neuroscientist, a social neuroscientist at UCLA, and Dr. Lieberman says that connection makes us smarter, happier, and more productive. You know, who doesn't want that, right? We all need that. But in addition to that, it also makes us more resilient to stress. It engages what's called the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, and it just makes us more resilient to cope with stressors in our life. It helps protect us from illness. It also heals damage that stress does to the ends of our chromosomes. And many of you in the audience may know about, there's a great book written just a couple years ago based on a Nobel Prize that was awarded to the researchers. It's called telomerase. It's an enzyme that connection and other activities releases that helps protect our chromosomes from damage that stress does, that kind of unwinds the ends, what are called telomeres of chromosomes. And then you can see here what I quoted earlier, just that connection is associated with a 50% reduced risk of early death. Now, the opposite of connection, or I should say the lack of connection, we all need connection to thrive. And so if we have those supportive relationships, we're more likely to thrive. If we are going without that connection, then we will struggle, because disconnection is a super stressor. I'm not going to go through all these. Let me just put them on the screen, but you can see all these negative outcomes. That it affects our clarity of thinking. It affects our sleep. It makes us less likely to be self-controlled, so we're more likely to overeat or do other things that are coping mechanisms we don't feel well when we're in a state of chronic stress response. And basically what's happening here is when the body is at a state of balance called homeostasis, then blood, glucose, and oxygen are being circulated to all the body's systems at levels that are required to maintain good health. But if we feel threatened, if we feel stressed, and we don't have the supportive relationships to calm our nervous system, then we'll go into a state of stress response. And then blood, glucose, and oxygen is over allocated to the fight or flight systems, which would include the heart, the lungs, the big muscles, and it's under allocated to certain bodily systems, including the hippocampus in the brain, the digestive system, the immune system, and the reproductive system. So those systems are being shortchanged the blood, glucose, and oxygen they need to be healthy. Now, if it's an acute stressor, which just means a short-term stressor, like perhaps you're being, someone is threatening your life, they want your money, then, going to stress response is good. But what we're finding, because it may help you survive. However, if we're in a state of chronic stress response because we don't feel safe, we're working in a workplace where we don't really have people who have our backs, and we're under stress, that's not good. That puts us in a state of chronic stress where these certain bodily systems are being under-resourced, which means we won't feel well. And when we don't feel well, we start looking for ways to cope. And as Katie pointed out earlier, many of these are they're addictive. And research shows, Steve Sussman, who's a professor at USC, did research back in 2011. It's the most current research available that we found. And he concluded that 47% of Americans have one or more addictions. That also, I should point out, that have negative consequences for our health. So connection is extremely important to help us not only survive or to thrive in life, but to survive as well. It affects our life expectancy. So we want to ask you, over the next 3 years, what do you expect in your life? Do you expect stress will rise, or will it roughly stay the same, or do you expect it will decline? So if we could do a poll here, Tony, let's see what people expect. I'm curious to see how they feel about their future.
Okay, the polls are open, everyone. Just a few seconds longer.
Okay.
And everyone, please keep your questions coming. I am seeing a few in the chat box, and thank you for those. And I'll save them till the end of Michael and Katie's formal talk, and then we'll leap right into them. So thank you. All right, I'm going to wrap this up in just a few seconds. Well, the results are striking to me anyway. It looks like mostly even thirds with, I guess, a slant toward decline. So
Ooh,
roughly,
Oh,
yeah,
good.
roughly 40% are saying decline, and the rest are even, split, 30% each.
Okay,
yeah,
well, that's good news.
that's
This is the
great.
first time we've seen that, I have to say. So this must, maybe a lot of people in the audience are retiring, expecting to retire. It'd be interesting to know, what people's rationale is for that. So, that's good news for those who expect stress to decline, or stay the same, probably. Many people are concerned about just rising stress, that just the world's becoming more competitive. And the other part of the equation that we've talked about is just, do you have that connection in your life that will help you support, cope with stress? So let's see what people think about that. Over the next 3 years, what do you expect with respect to human connection? That will rise, stay the same, or decline in your life?
All right, we have half the votes in. We'll wait a little longer.
Ooh,
This one's shaping up quite differently.
ooh,
Ooh, a cliffhanger.
yeah. Hmm.
Okay, almost completed here, folks. The results will shock you.
Ooh,
Ooh.
Mm.
yeah,
All right,
yeah.
I'm going to call it. I see roughly 60% are saying it will rise, and maybe about 10% say it will be declining, and the remainder 30% say it will stay the same. 60% say it will rise.
Okay,
Okay, well, that's
that's
good
great.
news for all the people who are on this
Mhm.
this program. So your expectations are that's good. If you expect stress will decline and connection will rise, then you're going to be in better shape. It's going to
Mhm.
have a positive effect on your lifespan. So I would encourage you to, when you look at the aggregate data in the US, I think there's also concerns about just the effects of artificial intelligence. Um, is are people going to become less connected because we will be interacting more with machines? And we use research from AC Nielsen, and we see that the average adult is spending 8 or 9 hours a day in front of screens. And also, young people are spending much more time in front of screens. It's crowded out time for face-to-face interaction, and it's also reduced the amount of hours they sleep. This is with adolescents in particular. So we would encourage you. It sounds like many of the people who are with us today are in relatively good shape. But I would encourage you to think about your family members, your friends, your colleagues at work, to really be aware of this, and whatever you can do to boost connection in their lives will help them. So let's move on
Mhm.
here. Okay, so the benefits to teams and organizations, let's just go through these briefly. And what we find is that when people do have higher connections, they think more clearly, they are more engaged, so they give more effort in their work, they align their behavior with an organization's goals. So for leaders, a lot of benefits here when you think about how it's going to affect organizational or team performance. It improves the quality of decisions because people who are connected, they care about the team's performance, and so they're more likely to speak up and give decision makers the information they need to make the best decisions. And they also engage in creative conversations that have a positive effect on innovation. They also improve the organization's agility and adaptability because they're pulling together. So they're looking for threats or opportunities in the broader environment. They're working together, collaborating, cooperating to do something about it. And that's boosts agility and adaptability. So when you think about it, these are 6 different benefits that add up to a very powerful performance advantage for any team or organization. And the data really supports this. The Gallup organization has 1.8 million respondents from countries around the world in diverse industries. And when they looked at teams, business units, they found that the top quartile from engagement and connection. They measure engagement with what's called the Q12, and the Q12 is, if you ask Gallup scientists, they'll tell you it's about attachment. It's largely about attachment, which is another word for connection. And when they looked at the top 25% with the highest connection in all their data, and they compared the performance of the bottom 25%, here's what they found. The top 25% were 21% more productive than the bottom 25% or bottom quartile. They were 22% higher in profitability, 10% higher in customer metrics like customer satisfaction, and a whopping 41% fewer quality defects, which is extraordinary, and almost 50% fewer safety accidents. So you think of industries like healthcare or construction or nuclear power, things where safety and quality are very high priorities. Connection makes a huge difference, and it's curious in a way, isn't it? It's not really intuitive that it would have such an impact, but the large scale, huge data that Gallup has shows that it does have a huge impact across the board, and especially on these things like quality defects and safety accidents, and no surprise also on employee turnover. So in our model we talked about earlier, vision, value, voice is an easy way to remember how to create a connection culture. Let me just give you the definitions briefly with a few examples. So vision, our definition is when everyone in the organization is motivated by the mission, united by the values, and proud of the reputation. The mission is about where we're going, values about how we're going to get there in terms of what's legitimate or illegitimate ways to get there. So for example, in Costco's case, we're not going to break the law. We are going to obey the law, which I talked about earlier. And that produces a reputation that people are either proud of, they're indifferent to, or they're embarrassed by. And organizations like Costco or some Kettering, TCU, others, there's a real pride that you see among the employees because of this vision that is they're serving people in a way, and they're doing it in a way that is it's ethical and that values people, which kind of leads us to the next element, that the element of value, which we define as when everyone in the organization understands the needs of people, the needs that Katie talked about earlier: respect, recognition, belonging, autonomy, personal growth, meaning, and progress. And when they understand that, and they go beyond that to also just appreciate the positive, unique contributions of their colleagues and express that. And going beyond the verbal appreciation, they're also looking for ways to help their colleagues. So they're not competing with them, they're collaborating and cooperating and looking for ways to help bring out the best in their colleagues. And that, if you've experienced that type of culture, whether it's maybe you were involved in sports or band in high school, things like that, or in the workplace, it's a phenomenal, it's a very energizing and engaging culture to be part of. And then finally, voice, which exists when everyone in the organization seeks the ideas of others, which reflects humility. They share ideas and opinions honestly, which reflects honesty as a character strength, and they safeguard relational connections. In other words, if there is disconnection, if I say something that hurts your feelings, I'm more sensitive to that I need to take the initiative to repair the relationship so that those disconnections don't last very long and grow into rivalries or sometimes silo behavior. Whole departments are not cooperating because of disconnection. So we wanted to share with you some building blocks before we get into the question and answer time we have. And let me briefly go through these. We're also, just so you know, we're going to offer you a book summary from Get Abstract of our book Connection Culture and sample chapter. So we're going to give you some free resources at the end. But let's just briefly go through some of the building blocks to create a connection culture. Number one, it really has to start with connection mindset. That we have to understand that connection is a superpower and disconnection is a super stressor, and helping people understand that so that they will be committed to being intentional about boosting connection. And then cultivating the habits of attitude, what Katie went through earlier, the attitudes, language, and behavior that connect, and that's in our book. memorizing the 3 V's. It's really easy to remember: vision, value, voice. We found managers remember that: communicating and inspiring vision, valuing people, and giving them a voice. If you do that, you'll be better than 99% of the managers, and you'll have a successful career. Keeping in mind also that the battle in organizations to have a good culture really takes place at the subculture level. In most organizations, you'll find that there are cultures of connection and cultures of disconnection. And it just goes to show that very few organizations are number one, understand this. And number two, they're intentional about creating connection cultures. So it really comes down to each subculture in the organization and mentoring and coaching to help leaders create connection cultures at the subculture level. So it's important to understand, what's the current state of the subculture you're in, whether you work in the subculture or the leader of the subculture, and what actions need to be taken to strengthen connection in your subculture. So establishing and promoting core values that connect, we talk about that in our book, values like caring for people, gratitude, forgiveness. We use the values of the positive psychology movement in our work. Hiring, developing, promoting for competence and connection skills. Not if you send somebody's a disconnector, then it's important to think very carefully before you hire them and think about just the impact they might have on others. Employing knowledge flow sessions, which is a practice that we talk about in our book and articles we've written. And it just means going out and seeking the opinions and ideas of others. And we lay out a process to do that. In the best organizations, think of organizations like Southwest Airlines or Ritz-Carlton, they have a leader who's responsible for culture, who reports into the CEO, and they have cultivated relationships around the organization that who are reporting in positive examples of people living up to the culture. And this is they develop a culture team with culture ambassadors throughout the organization. And it's important to identify those ways people are connecting and disseminate them, like Costco was doing with giving people a voice through recording these videos of people who were coming up with great ideas and disseminating those things through stories and practices. Carving out one day, I find this is for me because I'm a driver personality, I'm task oriented, and I find I have to really put it in my calendar. I have to have one day a week that's focused on connection and gets me away from my phone and task. Katie is shaking her head yes here, looking at me. And making sure I'm spending time with family and friends. I need to just be disciplined about having at least one day a week to do that. And in your family, prioritizing family meals. There's research that shows that for children, this is very important to have that time to process where cell phones are put away. And it's just about conversation and reconnecting. I remember with Katie and the girls, they would go through their day from kind of start to finish, and Katie would say, tell me stories. So that's important. Limiting screen time for kids to maybe 2 or 3 hours a day. It's not a bad practice for us to be, of course we have to be in front of screens at work, but putting some reasonable limits on screen time. There's a good book, by the way, iGen by Jean Twenge at San Diego State, I believe, who really gets into these issues if you're interested in just how to help adolescents with this issue.
Okay, we have to watch screen time for ourselves too.
Yes. And getting active in your community is important. One of the things I love about where we live, just about wherever I go, I feel like I know people. Sometimes I go in the grocery store, I know 4 people. It takes me forever to get out of there. So, but I love that. I just find there's a real joy. And the research supports that when we have those connections in the community, that it helps us as well. Never worry alone. This comes from Ned Hallowell, formerly of Harvard Medical School. Has shared, and that's such wise advice that when we worry alone, oftentimes our brain is processing in the midbrain. We're more likely to make rash decisions. So it helps to process things that are worrying us with other people, and that helps us make more rational decisions, and it calms the nervous system. And then making resilience practices habitual. So for example, exercise, meditation, prayer, things like that really help us as well. And it helps us to health issue, healthy eating, Katie's pointing out to me, is important as
Staying
well.
hydrated.
Yeah, staying hydrated.
I usually forget.
Yeah, so these help bring out the best in us so that we can help, we can reach out and connect with others. So the challenge is to be intentional about connecting. And we think of people as really falling into three groups. They're intentional disconnectors, which psychiatrists call the dark triad: sociopaths, narcissists, Machiavellians. One thing they can't do is they don't have the ability to attune to people's emotions. They're very low on empathy. And fortunately, they're only about 1% of the population. You have to be on the lookout for them. Many of them end up in prison. Some end up as CEOs, I have to say. They're very driven not to have anyone who has power over them. And then most of us fall into the unintentional disconnector camp. Just we have blind spots that we don't see that need to be developed. And when we're intentional about that in community with others, then we become intentional connectors. And that is what helps us have a positive effect on the people around us. And it improves our lifespan, our productivity, our joy in life as well. So there's a picture of Katie with Nick the doorman, who we talked about at the beginning. And so we have some resources for you, and then we'll get to the Q&A here in a minute. You can email Katie at connectionculture.com and put ExecuNet in the offer, and we'll send you some sample chapters of Connection Culture, the get abstract of the book, and then also put you on our monthly Connection Culture email newsletter list. So let me open it up here. Any questions for us, Tony?
Yes, Mike and Katie, thank you. We do have some questions. Okay, let's start with this one. In terms of companies that you've worked with that were facing disconnection or connection challenges, what types of metrics, whether they were hard numbers or just qualitative experience, did they bring to you that today anyway suggested that they were in a culture that was not connected? Did they measure this stuff? Were they able to tie it to not just, I guess, revenue and things of that order, but any other metrics that might be useful to our listeners today?
Well, good question. Far and away, Tony, what we see is people come because they're seeing low levels of employee engagement and high levels of employee turnover. Mm-hmm. So those are real signs, and extreme examples, you'll see suicides. And we've actually had a number of engagements recently, even in the last month, where the cultures were experiencing higher rates of suicide. And the Centers for Disease Control has recommended the strategy to reduce the risk of what's called suicide ideation is to boost connection with family, with friends, with community. And connection or suicide is also linked to burnout. Christina Maslach, who's a pioneering researcher in burnout and created the Maslach burnout inventory, she has said in recent years that more and more evidence is piling up that it's a lack of connection that really drives burnout. And so these things are very closely linked. When, as I pointed out earlier, when we don't have that connection to support us with normal stressors or higher stressors in our life, it really sets us up for burnout and in the most extreme cases, suicide. And also it boosts violence. It's you look at the people who have been in the news for mass violence, right? Shooting. They're all lonely people, and that can breed anger. And one phenomenon is called displacement aggression behavior. It tends to be mostly in men, and you see this less in women, and the research supports that. When someone is violent, it does reduce stress on the part of the perpetrator. So if Katie were to punch me, it would reduce stress in her and increase stress in me, sure, if that happened. But so it, also incivility is verbal. You can think of it as verbal violence, sexual violence. All of these things have the effect of reducing stress on the part of the perpetrator.
Mhm.
So you can expect just higher anxiety, depression, suicide, addiction in cultures that are high on stress and low on connection.
Got it. Thank you. Let's talk about the potential unique challenges of giving, say, remote workers a voice and connecting them with an organization. And many of us work with a distributed workforce, virtually or otherwise, and it's tough to bring everyone together physically in a location. But if you would please share with us some approaches to potentially connecting with people who are remote workers who need to be part of that culture.
Well, a couple things come to mind. Number one, it's very important for remote workers to know that they need connection. If you're just working from home all the time alone, you're very vulnerable to some of the negative consequences of loneliness and social isolation. So, all because you're apart physically, geographically from your colleagues, you can't connect with them. And so it's important for you to get engaged in your community, to get out for lunch or breaks or group exercise or volunteer in your community. You need that need for human connection needs to be met, or you're going to dysfunction. There are also some things that supervisors can do. We were just down in Tampa speaking, and we're going to actually record this. One of the participants in the group that we spoke to shared how she would open up group meetings online and have people share. It was something about their interests outside of work, I
Yeah, I
believe.
think it was an open-ended question that, tell us something good that's happened recently, or yeah, gave kind of an open mic. Oh, yes, okay, it's coming back to me. And as people kind of threw out what they were doing, it might be like, I'll make this up. I went skydiving yesterday, and somebody else in the group might be like, I love skydiving, and so you find little things that you have in common, little connections. And she said that as she's been doing this practice with them, now when she opens up the meetings, there's all this conversation that's going on. Hey, how was your skydiving over the weekend? Or, they are forming friendships, though they are scattered geographically. And yeah, but finding the things that they have in common has been really helpful. They're developing friendships with each other. So I think it's the supervisor needs to be extra intentional about building those bridges of connection and kind of drawing that remote worker out, so that there is that feeling of camaraderie that you might get as you're, pouring your second cup of coffee in the office kitchen or something, just the casual conversations that might come up.
Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about meetings, which many of us spend many hours every day in. And I guess one of the great ironies in this context of meetings is while we're all together, in theory, we're connecting on something, a strategy, a plan of implementation. And yet, for many of us, there are moments we'd much rather avoid than embrace as moments of connection. Any thoughts on how we might transform those natural meeting places into better moments of connection?
Well, a couple things come to mind. I think, starting the meeting out with connection first. Like the example Katie just gave, to let people share something personal, or if it's a small group of people, to take time to greet we call it hi and bye, that you take time to personally greet everyone in the meeting if it's a small group, and to say bye when you leave, and that helps people feel connected. If you're the leader of the meeting, then my advice would be, don't invite people unless you expect them to have a voice in the meeting, because that's what's really key in these meetings. If people don't have a voice, if they're not speaking up, if they're just there sitting passively and they don't feel like they can contribute, then, or they're not contributing, then they're going to have a negative experience. So you really just want to invite the people you expect will speak up, or that you will encourage to speak up. And those are the people who really need to know and participate in the meeting. So you want to make sure that everybody is talking during the course of the meeting, and then they'll have a positive experience. It'll be an energizer for them if they have a voice in the meeting. And of course, when people have a voice, they also tend to feel more valued.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think as the leader, you need to be watching out for, has everyone had the opportunity to speak? You know, is anyone holding back? And you could kind of gently draw that person out. You know, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this, Jane, or, you know, if Jane has been quiet, kind of hanging back, and watching that people are not shutting each other down, that it really is an atmosphere where all the good ideas get to come out on the table and spur the conversation.
Mhm.
Not like, okay, great idea, let's go on. Or no, why would you bring that up? That's terrible. You know, if that seed gets in the room, then uh, the meeting is now taken a turn, and it's not going to go well.
Right, absolutely. I want to take one more. It's a good one. We talked about loneliness and isolation, and it's not unique to the senior level leader, but certainly many of us in those roles experience that on, I guess, a heightened scale at times, especially with all the pressure and stress around performance in those roles. Talk to us, if you can, a little bit about the role of vulnerability, where
Mm.
a leader can potentially make things better for themselves, but also people around them. But it's so difficult to get there. Any approaches you might want to share with our audience on how to be more vulnerable?
Well, I think a lot of leaders are threatened by the word vulnerability. It just sounds like I'm putting my shield down and I'm going to take some arrows. So I think another way to think of it is openness. Am I going to be willing to share more about my life, about my experiences, even the experiences that I learned from that were not positive experiences? I learned from my mistakes. And it's important to do that because I think it gives permission for other people to um, to do the same, and you want them to do that. Another part that comes to mind that I think is important is, and it has to do with trauma. When we've gone through traumatic experiences in life, we'll be speaking to a group of many of whom are who are doctors, and probably some of whom are surgeons. I know at least one surgeon will be there tomorrow. And it's not unusual that they experience some trauma just in the course of their work. And trauma doesn't heal. We don't heal alone. It really needs to be processed with others. It's just the way we're wired as human beings. And in our work with in interactions with Ted George at the National, who's a neuroscientist at the National Institutes of Health, one of the things I've learned is it's surprising. Even small things can create some trauma in the brain, like being in a car accident. Um, it's small things can be traumatizing if they're bothering us. And so to have those confidants, people we can process those things with and just share that, that bothered us. When we talk through these things, it helps heal that part of the brain that's damaged. Is for those who are technical and interested in this, it's a part of the brain. It's a switch that leads to the para-aqueductal gray, and that part of the brain triggers fight, flight, shut down, or stalking behavior. There's a great book on this that Ted wrote called oh, Untangling the Mind. Thank you, Katie. It's Theodore George. He's a neuroscientist at the National Institutes of Health and a professor at George Washington University. So those are just a couple things to come to mind. It's as human beings, we need that vulnerability or openness to really perform at our best. It's healing for us, and we want to give people around us permission to be open to, and it's in those relationships that really help us thrive in life. We need that.
Terrific. Thank you. And thanks for sharing that resource. So we have gone past the top of the hour, but it was so worth it. Thank you both so much for making time and sharing your insight. Thank you all for tuning in, sending me your questions. I think I got to like all of them. If I neglected to, I am sorry, but connect directly with Katie at the address you see, and you'll also get some great additional content. So thank you all again. Mike and Katie, any final thoughts before we officially wrap up today's masterclass session?
Well, I think for those who are online, you might have a final thought here too, Katie. Just a quick one I have is you can't give what you don't have. And so if you don't have sufficient connection in your life, that's the place to start. Be intentional about developing some friends and volunteering in the community. And you need that. And that will help equip you to help others meet their need, especially the people you're responsible for leading, help them meet their need for connection. So that's an important first step.
Okay.
Great. Thank you again. Thank you all. I look forward to seeing you all at the next session of Executive Masterclass. Bye for now.